Welcome to OK Now What? I'm your host, Kate Gladdin, episode 7. This is the show for people who know life doesn't happen to you. Life happens, and the impact it has is up to you. Hey, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode. I'm so excited, 2 weeks in a row of special guests. And this one I was kind of fangirling for a moment when she came on the screen because to me, I have only known of this wonderful woman a short time, but I had the privilege of getting to read her book and write a little testimonial for it, which was so easy because it was so incredible. But this woman, I think, is a powerhouse of a woman, even though she'll admit she often doesn't feel like it, which is what I love about her even more. But I brought her on the show because her journey and also her insights and teachings from it is just really powerful for everyday folk, although her journey does I guess, center around a particular something, and I'll let her share that in a moment. I think this story is relatable for any human out there, that especially one that's dealing with the unexpected. So without further ado, my special guest for today is the wonderful Katie Coleman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for that kind intro. I feel like I'm about to blush.
It's so easy to say. It's so genuine. I'm really thoughtful about who I bring on to the show, just because I love my audience and I always want to make sure they're getting tons of value. But it was also a selfish pick because, as I said, I just wanted to meet you too. So, and what's so fun is our books are coming out on the same day. So I purposefully haven't said the title yet because I kind of want to just take us back to 2020. You know, you've met a lovely guy. You're 29 years old. You're starting to do the thing, I guess, where it's like, should I settle down and, start a family, buy a house, all that kind of stuff. So tell me, it was an upside down year for everyone, 2020, but
Yeah, no,
your New Year's Eve that year was pretty big, memorable one for you. So to start with, can you take us back to that day and that time in your life?
yeah. So that is probably kind of the most wild New Year's Eve I've had, but not in a good way. um, so I ended up getting married actually kind of in the middle of the pandemic. So I got married in October of 2020. And my husband and I were kind of planning and doing all the things. We were in the middle of building our house. And we were um, moving to a new city, not too terribly far away from where we were, but I was establishing new healthcare in that city and everything to make sure it'd be safe for us to have kids, because I had had a number of symptoms that I was pursuing for quite a while that didn't have resolution. And then that all kind of came to a head on New Year's Eve, where I had a number of symptoms that I was pursuing for about a year and a half. And then I started to feel a hard mass in my upper right abdomen. Um, I brought this up to the new PCP that I was seeing in this new city that I was moving to, and they didn't seem too concerned about it. But I'd lost about 50 pounds in the last year, which meant that I could now feel this mass. And it just kept eating at me. Now that I had found it, I could not get that off of my mind. So I ended up going into an urgent care, just to get it checked out. I was worried that I might have had an enlarged liver thanks to a spiraling Google search. I actually thought that it could have been an enlarged liver from cancer, but I didn't want to say that because I knew the minute I'd say that, they'd kind of brush me off.
Mm.
And so I went in and presented with an enlarged liver to an urgent care. They felt the mass, sent me to the ER, and then in the ER, I would end up being diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer that had spread to my liver. So I had a mass about the size of a softball, a little bit larger than the size of a softball, and what would end up being 15 or more tumors in my liver. So we hadn't done biopsies or anything, obviously, at that point, but we are pretty certain, based on how large the mass was and the masses in my liver, that it was stage 4 kidney cancer. So it's kind of how I kicked off 2021 and leaving 2020 behind. So not a good
Oh,
start.
oh my gosh. Even just hearing that, like if you weren't in front of me and I know how this ends, I just got the same feeling all over again. And I've read your whole book. And so now I can let you guys know the title, of course, is Too Young for Cancer, and it's a roller coaster of a journey. Thank God we know how it ends. That Katie's here, kicking on.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I have to ask. It's such a cliche question, but how did you feel in that moment when you got that news?
Yeah, I like I'm actually really glad that you asked because I pictured that moment a million times before. Like I said, I was pursuing symptoms I was having for like a year and a half that everybody kept just reassuring me was anxiety. The reason the book is called Too Young for Cancer is because I had several doctors when I ran out of words and like descriptions to describe the feelings that I was feeling. I was asking them if we could rule out cancer because I just like knew and felt like something was wrong. One description I even ended up giving was like, I feel like my body is working harder to pump the blood around. Like there was like
Mm.
no description that I really felt like I could have for that. And I just kept being reassured that I was too young for cancer. And so soon as I got the news in the ER, that is all that like looped in my head. The very first immediate reaction I had was relief, which was a very, very weird emotion to feel in that moment because I'd pictured that moment a million times, right? Like I knew something was wrong. My biggest worry was that it was cancer. And so like I had pictured receiving that news so many times. And I pictured being terrified as one might be when you get the news that you have cancer. But that first immediate reaction was relief because I felt like I finally had somebody like explaining why I was feeling the way that I was. And it wasn't all in my head, like everybody kind of had led me to believe. And a lot of that had to do with the doctor that kind of delivered the news. He was very compassionate as well, too. But after that initial kind of like shock wore off, I definitely the fear set in after that. But I was very surprised that the very first emotion I had was relief, which really I think just speaks in general about a lot of folks in healthcare or in kind of really any atmosphere of their life of like when you know something is wrong, just the power of like being believed and taken seriously is something that it's just like very powerful how impactful that can be when you finally have somebody who's listening and just like highlights the importance of like having people who are passionate and listen in
Mhm.
moments of difficulty. It's kind of
Yeah.
rambling, but
Yeah. No, it's so true. I You can tell through your book you've experienced some of the best and the not so best parts of the of the healthcare system. And just for me being I'm a little bit of a psychology geek, I always tell people like the uncertainty is the worst part. Like your brain hates
yeah,
uncertain news more than negative news because if it's negative, at least then it can close the loop. It can start an action plan in response to that news. But when you're just not knowing, it just loops and loops and loops. And it's like that little bit of survival brain would rather know at least, okay, the tiger's coming and I can plan for that as opposed to where the heck is the tiger and is it coming kind of thing. So that's just me and
yeah,
my little,
exactly.
like, I like, oh, that actually, when you said relief, I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Just for that split second, your brain was like, closure on that part. And now you can go to that next chapter, which I mean, I am no word of a lie, not over exaggerating at all when I say it was a roller coaster with your treatment and everything that followed. So I'm not going to try and get you to take us through all of that. That's where you've just got to get Katie's book because, as I said, incredible read. And what I love most about it is just so raw and honest and vulnerable in your writing. I just am like so many times you're like, can I just climb through the book and give you a hug? Like, is this possible in any sense of it? But just to put into perspective for people, just how rare and serious this condition or the cancer is that you had. Because I think it even took a little while to know what specific cancer. Is that right? Within the kidney?
Yeah, definitely. So it took a while to get like we knew it was kidney cancer, most
Mhm.
likely even before we did a biopsy. But there was some hallmarks that my type of cancer had that suggested that it might be a rare subtype. One of those in my report, they call it a central scar, which is very iconic for a specific type of tumor that's usually supposed to be benign. It's called an oncocytoma. central scar, all those things are very technical terms. The way that I always picture it is like they showed me I still remember this now. In one of my very first appointments with my oncologist, they showed me the images of my scans, right? And they like pointed and like, this is your tumor, right? And I was like, I have no idea what any of that is. Like, could not identify any organ or any of that. I did not have a medical background. And all I could see is it looked like there was something, a massive thing in the middle of the screen that looks like it got hit by a giant asteroid. Like that's
Wow.
what these central scars are, is like if you look at it on a scan, it looks like something struck by an asteroid is what it reminds me of. Um, but those are pretty iconic for this benign tumor, which is why everybody kind of was a little confused in the beginning with my cancer. And so it took a million diagnostics to get to it. And we didn't officially confirm it until about 6 months in, when I ended up getting to surgery after many, many second opinions that confirmed that this was that type of benign tumor that's typically known to be benign. And it's called an oncocytoma. But in my case, obviously, it wasn't benign because it spread to my liver, which has only been observed single digits worldwide in history. So the benign tumors are relatively common. They're still rare, but they're relatively more common. But single digits is the number of times it's actually spread to another organ, which in my case was my liver. So not exactly the area you want to stand out or be unique in, but it was a kind of wild ride to get to that official diagnosis.
Yes. And then hearing on top about like the blood, did you have a blood condition or something? Like you couldn't, I just remember hearing that too on top of all your other stress. I was like, oh boy.
Yeah, and we didn't know I had a bleeding disorder initially. So when you get a biopsy, one of the things they ask you is like, do you have any bleeding conditions or anything like that? It's like, nope, I don't think I have any. Like, I
Mm,
never had been told I had any. Um, and then I ended up having a bleed during my biopsy, which is what led to us finding out that I had a bleeding disorder. Now there's some question that if that could have been caused by the tumor. But
okay.
they're just like medical journeys are just that. They're
Yeah.
they
Oh
they
God.
change up and down all the time. But it definitely complicated everything. So it was just like learning one thing after another. Felt
Yeah.
like you take one mini step forward and then like five steps back for probably that first 6 months to a year for me.
Yeah. That's what the book felt like too. As I read through, I was like
Yeah.
getting my hopes, like, okay, we're good. And then it's funny, like I guess in a book in that, or like you get a bit of a cheat, like you can see, okay, there's still a bit more to go though. So I'm guessing there's a few more twists and turns before the ending.
Yep.
Um, okay. So, we chatted a little bit about this before we hit record and stuff, but obviously like in, incredibly resilient to get through all of that. Um, but at the time, like, you're trying to get to the next test, the next treatment, the next operation and stuff. What do you feel like kept you going?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's really weird to look back on now, especially now that I'm a few years out. Because I look back now and like at the time when people were telling me like, how in the world did you manage to get through that? I was like, what do you mean? Like I just did what everybody would have done.
Mhm.
And now when I look back on that, I look back in that and even say like, man, how did I like manage to get through that? But what it all comes down to, it felt like for me, is like I didn't have an option. Like when your back is up against the wall, like you're just gonna start walking forward, because that is your only option. And so like my prognosis was pretty terrible in the beginning. Nobody was quite willing to give me a prognosis, but the estimations I was getting and from various things, like a lot of people didn't think that I'd live much beyond 12 months. To like maybe 18 months or so. And so my only option in my mind was, okay, if I want any fighting chance, then I'm going to have to keep looking or keep pushing. And it's amazing what that will motivate you
Yeah.
to keep doing in those moments. So I don't think I had anything like just intuitively in me in those. It was just like my only option, and I wasn't willing to just give up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could feel, I think about after my sister died too, like you just like, what world am I living in? Like your brain's trying to catch up with your own reality half the time. Like, am I really living this day and going through this? But I think, love was deeper than my fear and all my pain. And I feel like between you and your husband and that, I think like, I'm sure relying on each other and just that love and like having a reason why you want to keep pursuing. Like for me, it's like I want to live another day for my sister, and I'm sure in your case is it time like, just living another day to experience another day with the person you love. Do you feel like love was a pretty big motivator?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was for me, especially since I was like just married.
Yeah.
And we had gone from like, I distinctively remember this. We had gone from like planning out our next 30 years, right? We were like literally talking about our neighborhood and like how our kids would grow up in it, the schools that they would go to, like right before I got diagnosed. And then like in the ER, we were staring down stats that said I had an 8% chance of surviving the next 5. And so like when I was thinking about that moment and like as devastating as that was also thinking like, okay, but I do only have 5 years. What do I want that to look like? And it was
Yeah.
like, I want to be able to live the life that I was like planning. Obviously, it'd look very different
Mhm.
with my husband, but like we had just gotten married. Like I wanted to enjoy that time. But I'll also say that I think that comes in many, many different forms. Because for me, it's evolved a lot of kind of like how you found your purpose as well too. I've also found purpose in like I've unfortunately had a lot of friends that have passed away who had cancer because I've gotten to know the communities quite well,
Mm.
and it's heartbreaking, and it can kind of destroy you. And especially when you're a patient yourself, there's this like very dual mentality when that happens, where you're like grieving someone you really cared about while also facing the fact that you had something very similar or have the same thing. But for me, I've always kind of moved past those moments because I think about like, I want to be able to do some of the things that I know they wish they would have been able to do. Like,
Mm.
it's a way of kind of like honoring them by like being able to do the things that like I know they would have loved to do if they were here. So I've done a lot of stuff in the nonprofit space and for kidney cancer and stuff like that now. And a lot of that is like honoring those that have passed. Um, but that just comes in kind of, and in a lot of ways now, like I'm living on time that I once didn't think I'd have. So in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, like I kind of feel like, okay, like I'm doing the things that I never thought I would be able to do. And so it's like almost even honoring that in itself as well too. So I think it can take a number of different shapes because I think
Mhm.
depending on what that triggering moment is, like for me, it was having cancer, right? But everybody kind of goes through their own ups and downs, and none of us make it through life unscathed.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when you're in those moments, you can convince yourself that you don't have somebody to like lean on or continue for or something like that. But there's almost always
Yeah.
something to. And if even if it's to like be something for the person who is ever in the position that you are right now. That's motivated a lot of why I was so raw and honest in the book. I could have very easily painted a beautiful picture and made that very rose colored
Yeah.
journey, but I chose not to because those moments are raw and real. And sometimes, like, you need to be that for somebody else who is experiencing that as well too. So I think there's a lot of duality there. It can be for loved ones to move you through those moments, but sometimes it can just be for like either yourself or the person who is going to end up in that position, and you
Totally.
want them to have something else to look to.
Yeah. Yeah. Your book actually reminds me so much of one of my favorite quotes, which I'm probably going to butcher right now, but it's something along the lines of like, one day everything you've gone through will become someone else's survival book or guide kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there
Hmm.
is a lot of power in that. I feel like now, looking back on the first year or so after I lost my sister, just how much inspiration and strength I took from people who had shared their stories around grief, loss, trauma. And I was like, okay, I've soaked up all their strength and inspiration. And now I feel like it's my purpose and role to like put that back out in the world for for someone else. Yeah, that's so incredibly powerful. To just have a why, as they say, if you know your why, you can hold on through anyhow,
Yeah.
if it's possible. So that's really beautiful. And I do think you touched on an important point too. Sometimes, like when Nicole died, none of my friends had lost anyone close to them, let alone anyone younger and in an accident. And so suddenly, so it is easy sometimes to tell yourself, like, no one gets what I'm going through and things like that. So how pivotal or powerful do you think it was to start reaching out to those community and support groups, like in your journey along the way?
Yeah. I mean, they are like, I wouldn't be here without them for a number of different reasons. But they have done everything to me of like having somebody to relate to that like pulled me out of the bottom of the hole that I was digging myself into when I thought like, okay, I can't get through this. Like I'm not strong enough to get through this. And don't think people live through these kinds of things. Like I found another patient who was living and like encouraged me to like live the best life that I possibly could and shared all the ways that he was living his life. And there is something about connecting with somebody who's gone through similar experiences, even if it's not the exact same thing, but is in a different place than you are, because they can
Mhm.
relate to like feeling in that moment of exactly how you might be feeling now. And you can see they made it to the other side of that,
Yeah.
and see how they did that. Um, and for me, those communities ended up connecting me with the NCI, where I ended up having my surgery and all my second opinions. There's this
Mm.
beautiful network that, like, if you take a single one of them away, none of the other things would have ever been possible. And I
Yeah.
probably wouldn't still be here today. And
Hmm.
so I think it's crucial to find others that you can relate to. But kind of going back to your point of that might not always be the exact situation, right? Like I think my story is kind of the perfect example of that. Of I had this 1 in a million cancer. Like we think I was the only one alive in the U.S. with this specific type, and so I was never going to find somebody who had been through exactly what I had been through, but I was able to go to take from things that other people went through similar experiences. And
Hmm.
then that's why I shared on social media. And that's why I wrote my book afterwards, is because I was like, okay, I am that one case. So
Yeah.
now somebody else is going to have that blueprint, right? Even if it's only one example and somebody else's experience might be different. Um, but you can still both take from others to find those commonalities,
Yeah.
while also kind of having your own unique experience of that. I think I kind of heard that in what you were saying as well too, of you took kind of some of this advice of how to get through grief and everything like that. And I've always pictured those as you take the pieces that resonate with you.
Hmm.
You don't take the ones that don't, and then
Yeah.
you form that into something that like can cause change, or that resonates the most with you, and you create your own definition around it by
Yeah.
pulling all of these things together.
Yeah. And weaving it into what makes sense. And I think the one thing I've noticed is like, even though all our experiences are so different, the underlying feelings of just like helplessness, despair, loneliness, like that's something that like we can all come together and relate to. So if we can look past like, the specific diagnosis or which specific person in your life died, like, for some kids, obviously I've spent a lot of time speaking with youth and they might just be telling like my dog died. I'm like, no, like that. You like that will be grief and you'll have to work through it like just the same way. It's not like measuring up like whose case is worse or anything like that. I think
Yeah.
but yeah, I just wanted to touch on that because I think some people, and there's like online now, we're so blessed to live in an online world in that sense that you can connect right around the world with different people, whether it's like going through a divorce, a loss, cancer, any sort of health diagnosis where you're like, how do I navigate through this? Just, I don't know, sometimes we overlook some of the simple steps we can take to support ourselves, like reaching out to community groups. And I feel like something that um I really took away from your book too, or just as I reflect upon your story as I've read it, like you really seem to like trust your intuition. Is that something you always kind of did? Like I feel like you weren't gonna settle even when the people quote unquote smarter than you with the doctor's degrees and stuff. Like, yeah, did you always do that? Or is that something where you're like, I am got like everything to lose here. I'm just gonna go for it. Or yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, it's super interesting that like to hear you say that's what you picked up from it because for me in those moments like I'm like one of the most indecisive people on the planet. And so like I always feel like I'm always doubting my intuition.
Mhm.
But when you frame it that way, like I do know that there's this like kernel of truth for me of where like it's just how my brain works of like I have to see all of the pieces like
Mhm.
to say like okay, I can see this was fully evaluated with all of the information possible and the answer is no based on that. And so for me it was one of those like if there's a corner that somebody doesn't seem like they're paying attention to like I still might be wrong, but until we explore that corner and know that I'm wrong, um, it still gives me hope or an area to push in if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Like that makes me sound so stubborn when I
No,
say it
well, thank God you
back,
are,
but
because like the way that you ended up getting the surgery and that, because at first, if I recall correctly, they were like, I don't think we want to operate at all. Like it's too risky.
yeah,
Right?
it
Yeah.
was first surgery wasn't an option at all, and that was for many, many institutions. And it was kind of this, I had to learn from my own medical records. The very first time I read my pathology report, I was like, this has to be written in a different language. Like,
That would
what
be
even
me.
are these words?
Yeah.
And now like I've very nerdily gotten into the science behind it, and I could tell you like every staining, what it means, all of those
Wow.
things
Good for
now,
you. Yeah.
which I think helped me a bit in my diagnosis. But it was probably part of that. Like I wasn't willing to take something at face value if I didn't understand it. So I was going to do at least my best to understand it, to understand why they gave me that answer. And then if that answer still didn't quite fit, once I did understand it, that let me know like there was room to push and learn room to explore more. Because there's definitely some things that I didn't push on, but that was because like to me they made sense not to push on those certain areas because
Right.
they had answers or resolutions.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. And I think we also mentioned earlier, like a tendency, especially for women out there, is the people pleasing, be agreeable, be nice. Like, oh, the this lovely gentleman doctor said this. So I feel like I can even feel that when I go in for a general checkup or something, and I have a question, but I'm like, I don't want to ask it, or like, that fear of looking silly or like you said a little pedantic or whatnot. So you definitely stood up for yourself with that. So you can speak a little bit about that, but I'm curious, has that carried on? Do you feel like a new version of you in your life with that, like people pleasing, overcoming that tendency?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, it's different now. Like, I know when I need to push on certain things
Mm.
a little bit more, but it's still not easy for sure. Like, I still run into it all the time. And the number of times I've had the conversation with my husband of like, do I tell my doctor about this? Like, I feel like I should, but I don't know. And
Yeah.
like, you think I'd be an expert at this point from everything that I've been through, right? But we kind of have built these thresholds in kind of like, okay, if I mention it X number of times over a certain period of time, that's my trigger.
Okay.
And I've kind of built this system around like, it still doesn't always come natural for me, but
Yeah.
because I know that, like, I'm not going to let myself keep doubting myself. I've got these like little triggers of if I bring up a certain symptom like 10 times within like a couple weeks or something like that. That's usually our trigger for like, okay, this is persistent. You should probably mention
Yes.
something.
Yes.
And that's just one example. But I think like part of why I built those is because I mentioned how the feeling I felt in the emergency room was relief, first
Mm.
off. And that's because all of the symptoms that I was feeling. So for example, one of the symptoms I was getting was these like super, super severe lower abdominal cramps. They're still to this day one of the worst pains I've ever had. And that's coming from somebody who has had a liver resection, kidney removed, tumors burned out of their liver. Like this pain was still worse than that. And I was getting these really, really severe lower abdominal cramps. They'd happen 1 month or 1 week before my menstrual cycle each month. And so I didn't think they were menstrual cramps. Like they definitely like didn't feel the same. They were way more intense than I had ever felt menstrual cramps be. But when I presented to a lot of doctors with it, that's what it was explained off as. It was either menstrual cramps or possibly endometriosis. And for me, that made me doubt myself. And I was like, man, have I like just become a wimp or something? Like,
Mm.
is this like just normal? And all of a sudden my pain threshold is like super low. And I took it, I think that's something that I even wrote into the book is when I was being questioned by doctors, I took it as an evaluation of my character, not an opportunity to add clarifying detail, which is what these doctors are usually asking those questions around. It may not always come off like that. It oftentimes they're rushed through appointments. And so there's like the situation with our healthcare system, unfortunately, is just like not set up to like properly work through some of these things sometimes. But I think my biggest piece of advice to people, especially to women, is to like kind of trust your instinct, kind of what you're saying of like, I still knew something was wrong and I knew something was different. Um, my biggest regret in the year and a half before I got diagnosed is that people pleaser in me made me start altering the way that I was describing these symptoms to mirror kind of what the doctors were saying to me. So like when I felt like a wimp because like I couldn't handle these like really painful lower abdominal cramps, I started to bring them up in appointments with other providers. And when I had mentioned it to them, it would kind of become like, oh, yeah, sometimes I get these like really bad lower abdominal cramps, but I don't think they're menstrual cramps, but somebody said they might have been. And like, I just didn't
Mm.
have the conviction to stand. What I
Kind of
should have
beat
done
around the
in every
bush.
appointment was just like start from scratch, right? And be like, these
Mm.
things buckle me over. And
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like crying in the bathroom until like they pass. Like that should have been the language I used in every single appointment. But I let that fear and like that self-doubt change my language and how I presented. I'll say the one thing, this kind of loops back to something that you said previously about the fear. And like everybody, or not, you mentioned it in grief, but that everybody experiences grief. For me, I've think it comes to grief, pain, fear. These all kind of tie really closely together for me in I have people who are diagnosed with earlier stages and say like, oh, but it's nothing like what you went through. And I think the one biggest thing that has stood out to me being diagnosed with such a late stage cancer is the fear I felt in that moment was no different than the fear I
Mm.
felt in literally anything else I've done in my life that was like the most terrifying part of my life at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, fear is relative to what you have experienced. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is still very genuine and very real. And I think the pain that I was feeling in those times was very similar as well too. And so like I bring that into the topic as far as like if you are in those moments and you are doubting yourself, like take a moment and think about that and compared to what you have felt before.
Yeah.
And if that is still kind of extreme based on your baseline, that's what you need to make sure that you're communicating, not making your baseline on what your perception of how you should be feeling
Yeah.
based on somebody else's expectations, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Not just some random like make, and it's also, it's just such a fierce act of self-love when we're willing to speak up and make sure we're valuing ourselves and not valuing the other person, whether it's the doctor or whatever, their opinion of us more than, taking care and advocating for ourselves. So it's definitely a practice when I'm working through myself. But, obviously, your example, like advocate, like trying to figure out cancer diagnosis is a pretty big one to speak up about. But, um, the big message here is like if life is short and we should live it in ways that fulfill us and are meaningful. And if we're in people pleasing mode, it usually leads to the opposite of like resentment, misunderstandings. Yeah, just not true happiness. So you can take that even to like speak up about, even if the small things about like to the waiter or this and that. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to bother them. It's okay. I asked for this, but it's fine. I'll just eat. I'm so bad with that stuff. So I just think that's
Yeah.
a big message, and then one you can distill down to the small stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does come down to everything in life. I'll say having a cancer diagnosis, that is something that is like shifted and reframed that part a little bit about my life more is just recognizing how short life is. And so it
Mhm.
is important to pursue the things that like matter to you. And
Yeah.
like I think the perfect example of like when you're giving the example of like the waiter, for example, of like not wanting to send something back. Um, for me, the biggest realization that it's come is like you can send something back, but then also like sending something back doesn't mean that it needs to be like rude, right? Which I think is
Mm,
like what a lot of people stop themselves by doing,
yeah.
right? And so it just helps you kind of recognize that moment of like, yeah, you can speak up for yourself in a way that's just like you're just advocating for something that,
Genuine. Yeah.
yeah, you need or want. But that you're speaking up probably looks very, very different than the person that's like, how dare you let my
Yeah.
potatoes touch XYZ, right? It's probably
Yeah.
like, hey, I'm so sorry, I didn't order potatoes.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's
No, that's so true. It's our brain, tends to catastrophize or overthink things and everything like that. So very, very true. And I think I just want to say this to you because I know we've both been close to death in different ways. You personally and me. I call it a near death experience, the death of someone near to me. That's my near death experience. But don't you think it's so ironic? Like, I don't know, like you need darkness for the lights to shine, like the contrast of that, right? But I think one of the biggest ironies of life is like how much being close to death can teach you about living.
yeah.
Like, I don't know, I just know that will like resonate with you and anyone else who's being close to death. Like, it's just the irony of um, that truth, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, what's something you've done? I mean, you're doing amazing work in advocating for other cancer patients, both here and those who have passed on, like just doing amazing work in that field. But what's something you've done for you personally, or maybe like you and your husband or something that you've done since you've recovered from treatment and everything that you probably wouldn't have done? Like you've taken that lesson of like life is short and you've just done something for yourself.
Yeah, I think so mine's gonna sound weird because like I think the biggest thing that it has taught me is to like live life authentically and to live in whatever that means for you. And so for a lot of people, I was actually just having this conversation yesterday with somebody. A lot of people like imagining what they would do if they like could just do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to worry about work, didn't have to worry about anything else. What would they want to do with their time? A lot of people that's like, I want to relax on the beach or like be out in nature and those kinds of things, which I do find enjoyment of. But for me, like, I am super nerdy. And so for me, like, the thing that I love doing is like programming and creating things. And so, for example, my husband, the last 2 years, he's been such a trooper. He's also a software engineer. Um, and so he's asked me what I wanted to do for my birthday for the last 2 years because my birthday, when I was diagnosed, like we went all out for my 30th birthday and like did some of my favorite things, like being outside and kind of those other things that we described, right? Like it was
Mhm.
all those things that I identified as like relaxing. And it was beautiful, beautiful moment. Um, and so like that was something that I took time to have. And that's such a beautiful memory for me that like I almost kind of want to hold and preserve that
Mm.
as that memory. And then
Mhm.
since my diagnosis, now I do a hackathon with my husband for my birthday every year, where the two of us, we go rent an Airbnb somewhere that's like beautiful. Like we went out to the coast for this last one, and I do this combination of like we go out and do something like hang out on the beach for a short period of time, and then like I program the rest of the time, and I
Aw.
make something. Last couple times we've made projects that can impact patients that have cancer, and then I just open source them. But it's before I would have never done that because I was like, everybody's gonna like, who in the world wants to sit and program on their birthday? Like, don't you
Yeah.
want to get away from work? Like, that's not. why in the world would you want to do that?
Yeah.
But I think that's what my diagnosis really changed for me is I was like, no, do the things that you find enjoyable. It doesn't matter if other people
Yes.
think they're enjoyable. Most people wouldn't find that enjoyable. Um, but you've got to be like true to yourself and authentic in those things. And that's one of the biggest things that I took away is I do that a lot more often now. Is I'm
Yeah.
like, I realize
Heck
this
yeah.
isn't the norm. This isn't what people normally do, but this is what I enjoy doing. So I'm going to
Yeah.
do it.
And I think the more quirky like those things are, like the more you know you are living true to yourself and like have found yourself through it. So, my whole message about resilience is, it's not trying to make every experience that you go through in life a positive one. But through how you choose to respond, you can make it purposeful. And I think that's why what inspires me most about your journey, you've kept it real, like your book. It really does read like a movie. You're an incredible writer, and the details in that. I'm like, I've struggled to remember what I had for breakfast, and you're like bringing scenes to life. So really kept me turning every page, much to my husband's horror. I'd be like, just 5 more minutes, I just got to finish, and then I'd start quickly on the next chapter. I'd be like, sorry, I'm halfway through this chapter now, I can't stop. um so just thank you for being a living example of resilience and just defying the odds, not letting a number of a certain percentage or whatever define you. And I know you weren't feeling brave and courageous and resilient at the time, but I know you're a shining light for so many people out there. Even me personally now, I have my little, I don't know, CEO board member people that like I have next to me here on my desk. I'll show you. So I named my puppy dog after him, but Eddie Jaku is a Holocaust survivor that I met um, back in Australia, probably about 4 years ago now. But he wrote a book, Happiest Man on Earth, which I absolutely love. And um, sometimes simple questions like what would Eddie do? And little things like I'm gonna hold on to stories that you've shared in moments that when all hope feels lost, you're an example that it's really not. So let people know where they can find your amazing book, connect with you, especially, the reality is there will be people listening who have either themselves or loved ones going through a cancer diagnosis. So I know you've got some great resources. So this is your chance to share all about that now.
Yeah, thank you. I think I think it's incredible that you like keep him on
Oh, yes.
your desk there and like refer to it. I think that's like so important. That's like what we were talking about, right? Of like you take these little pieces from people who like
Hmm.
help make a better version of you. But I do want to touch for a second on what you said about the like I didn't feel um certainly not resilient as I was going through the process.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I noticed from your book is we're transitioning to talk about books here yet. I haven't had a chance to dive in, and I cannot wait to, because one of the first things that jumped out to me in the description of your book, and some of what you've been through is just that like sometimes you just have to get through it. Like there's
Hmm.
no like positivity. There's like you sometimes you're just getting through it.
Hmm.
And I have an entire chapter of my book that you've read, which is The Only Way Out is Through.
Hmm.
And that experience was not a cancer experience. That was me repelling. And so the kind of the biggest thing that I want to kind of leave people with is like the realization, and that's the biggest thing that I hope people take from my book. Yes, it's a book that I really hope helps patients with cancer or people whose lives have been touched with cancer, so loved ones or friends. But the biggest thing is that that shared experience is kind of the same of like the only way out is through
Hmm.
everything that I went through. Yes, it's on the extreme end of things, right? By nature of what I was dealing with. But at the end of the day, like when I look back through those moments, never at one point did I ever feel like I am doing this right.
Yeah.
And like this is like I am being resilient in this moment. Like it felt unnatural a lot of the times. And that's why I wrote my book very honest and very raw to talk about like how that did feel very unnatural to me. But when you get out on the other side of those things is really when you realize the power and impact that you had for them. So just like encouragement for anybody who might feel like they're in the thick of things.
Yeah.
Like just keep pushing because that might be a sign that you are definitely on the right track
Yeah.
in a lot of cases
Yeah.
as well too.
Yeah. And I just think you can really resonate. Like, there's new fields of study now about post-traumatic growth, and like our ability to become stronger and grow because of our trauma, not in spite of it. Um, but I always have to remind people it's an extension of post-traumatic stress. Like you have to still go through the dark times, the lost times, the hopeless times, and then you get to the growth. There's no like hop, skipping, jumping your way to like, and now I'm more positive about this. It's
Yeah.
you really got to work your way through it. So it's more like you said, if you're in the middle of the dark tunnel, like just keep going, like little by little. And as I said, you're a shining light along the way for people that are feeling lost in that. So yeah, your
Yeah.
book, Too Young for Cancer, goes on sale November 12th. Woo woo. Where can we get our hands on that? And YouTube, Instagram, all that stuff you got going on?
Yeah, so all of it is the best place to find kind of everything all in one place is I have a website, katiekickscancer.com. And that has my memoir, all the places to purchase it. Um, and also has links to like my TikTok, Instagram, and a whole bunch of resources for patients who might be diagnosed with cancer. I actually even shared the writing journey because, as you know, getting a book deal is quite the process,
Yes.
and definitely it's not easy. And so I shared kind of my process as I went through the writing experience. And on my website, under the videos section, there's a writing section that walks through that part as well too, in case anybody is interested in those kinds of
No,
things as well
that's
too.
so
So
helpful. I always joke most of my writing was done about 30,000 feet in the air to and from Australia because that's what you can't, you got to block everything out. And but it is like just from having the idea, especially there's so many people going through extraordinary things. The more we can get these stories out there and the lessons and everything. So thanks for sharing that also. And shout out to our awesome editor Laura connecting us. Because she
yes,
edited your book, right? You did that
yes,
together with Laura?
absolutely. She is amazing. I
Yeah.
don't think my book would have existed without her. So
No,
she's
she's a
been incredible.
gem. It's really cool. I jumped on a call with her about writing this, but we'd written something previously because all my other books were for teens and that. But I realized we got on a call and it was a 10-year anniversary of my sister's passing. And that's like when we kind of like offered me the contract and stuff. And I just remember looking up and being like, okay, Knickers, I get it. Like, I'm ready to do this. Because I always kind of said I wanted to write a book about my own stories and everything like that. And so it just felt like I get little nudges from Nicole every so often, like, hey, you're ready for this. You better go do it now. And so that was awesome. So yeah, Laura's an absolute gem. And I hope she listens to this. So
Yep.
she can hear us absolutely bragging on her. I just thank you so much again, Katie. I want to continue to learn how I can keep supporting your journey and all that you do. And I'm really grateful that our paths cross. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to continue to connect.
Absolutely.